This presentation is about a learning phenomenon called respondent conditioning. It's also been called classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning after a Russian physiologist who was one of the first to discover it. Just to say, there's material in this particular presentation that may not be covered in the assigned reading but is in the objectives. Classical or respondent conditioning is the most primitive form of learning. It was the first kind of learning that was developed in organisms. It involves reflexes, which are sort of an invariant connection between some stimulus and a response that have some adaptive value for the organism. In other words, that help survival. These are adaptive because they require no real period of development present at birth, and it does not require the same kind of neurological or brain complexity to be present. So reflexes are evolved and genetic. But reflexes can come under control of previously neutral stimuli, and this is really the nature of respondent conditioning. As it turns out, there are very important connections between operant and classical learning, and classical learning appears to be involved in many human problems such as anxiety or phobias or unrealistic kinds of fears that are discussed in your reading, and I'll discuss them a little bit. Basic paradigm of a reflex is a unconditioned stimulus. That's what it's called. It's basically some stimulus that when it's present, it elicits a particular response. If someone hits your patellar tendon in your knee with a hammer the right way, you'll kick. It's not a conscious kind of thing, and it's automatic. This pairing, the stimulus-response pairing, is called a reflexes. There are many natural reflexes in all species, and there are many natural reflexes in human beings. Human reflexes include blinking of eyes at a loud sound or a puff of air, sneezing when nasal mucosa are irritated, sweating to high temperatures, salivating when food's in one's mouth, release of milk during nursing, when there is a pain or a very intense stimulus present, so heart rate increase in adrenaline, glucose release, constriction of visceral vessels, dilation of skeletal muscles. This is a combination of things that is involved in many things, emotions, anxiety, and so forth. It's also related to the idea of the fight or flight reflex. And there's often a conditioned attenuation of responses to psychoactive drugs. It's discussed in your reading. So humans have these reflexes. Some reflexes can be conditioned, but not all reflexes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Other kinds of inherited connections between stimuli and responses are involved in defense reactions that are specific to species, species-specific sexual behaviors. Think about the peacock, for example. The spreading of the tail feathers is a signal. There are species-specific behaviors that are triggered by stimuli related to obtaining food. And there are fixed responses to pain or to aggression or to threats that are inherited. These are a little more complex, and they're in essence reflexes in the sense that there is a releasing stimulus or a stimulus followed by some pattern of behavior. These typically cannot easily be conditioned, although some of them can. If you read the article, it's an optional thing. A type of classical conditioning occurs for many of these complex types of behaviors because it helps the organism prepare for the actual reflex. So it's a learned reflex. We'll see what that is in a minute, but it prepares the organism to respond in a better way. So we have these reflexes, and as it turns out, they can be involved in learning. In other words, reflex involves some stimulus that invariably elicits some response. That's a reflex. If a neutral stimulus is paired in a certain way with the unconditioned stimulus, there's the diagram, neutral stimulus, unconditioned response. After a number of trials, that neutral stimulus alone elicits a response that's very similar to the reflexive response. It's called a conditioned response. So we have a conditioned stimulus now that elicits a conditioned response because it's been paired. And in the real way, the real world, it elicits the conditioned response as a way to prepare a stronger response in nature. It's an adaptive kind of functional idea. So respondent learning involves an unlearned reflex coming in control of a neutral stimulus. And it's discussed in your readings. In Pavlov's classical experiment, also discussed in your reading, he was a physiologist looking and studying salivation. And he was looking at the elicitation of salivation for the presence of food or the odor of food. So food's an unconditioned stimulus that in the presence of food in a dog's mouth, in Pavlov's case, it elicited salivation, an unconditioned response. He then rang a bell prior to presenting the food to the dog. The dog salivated with the food, and soon the bell became a conditioned stimulus that without the presence of the food elicited salivation. And then Pavlov realized he had a learning paradigm here. An unlearned reflex now came to be elicited by a previously neutral stimulus, in this case a bell. Not all kinds of pairing of neutral stimuli and unconditioned stimuli produce the same strength of learning. The most effective pairing occurs when the neutral stimulus occurs up to 5 seconds, or half of a second, before the unconditioned stimulus, and this is the strongest way for it to become a conditioned stimulus. So, neutral stimulus shortly before the unconditioned stimulus, and it eventually becomes a conditioned stimulus. A long delay occurring 5 seconds or more before the unconditioned stimulus produces very weak learning. Other arrangements can result in conditions, but also are not as effective. Trace conditioning is a situation where the neutral stimulus is presented more than 5 seconds prior to the unconditioned stimulus. There's no overlap. And any conditioned response is very weak. Backwards conditioning is where the neutral stimulus is presented following the unconditioned stimulus. Under most conditions, no conditioning occurs at all. Just like with operant conditioning, extinction and generalization can occur. Extinction in a classical paradigm occurs when the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are never paired. In other words, there's no pairing so that the reflex is elicited by the unconditioned stimulus. And after a while, the conditioned stimulus loses its potency. There's a clear chart for this in one of your assigned readings. It's an important idea. It's also important to note that spontaneous recovery can also occur with classical conditioning, just like operant. Phenomenon of generalization is where a stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus also elicit a conditioned response, although there's never been any pairing. There's a gradient, just like an operant generalization of generalization here. And so if the unpaired stimulus differs greatly from the conditioned stimulus, then eventually it does not elicit the conditioned response at all. This table, courtesy of Richard Malott, provides a contrast between respondent and operant extinction. For the first column after the titles, you can see the difference between respondent extinction, which involves not pairing the CS with the US, and operant extinction, which involves not presenting the reinforcer or removing the aversive condition for negative reinforcement. Responding is not necessary for extinction to occur with respondent conditioning, although it would for a while, but it is necessary for operant extinction to occur. The response has to occur and not be reinforced for it to be extinguished. And then you can see the results. So this provides a succinct compare and contrast operant and respondent extinction. Just like with operant behavior, an unconditioned response involves really a response class of very similar topographical responses. Certainly every time a reflexive action occurs, the reflex behavior itself is not exactly the same. So all possible variations that would be elicited by the unconditioned stimulus constitute a response class, and really the same goes for the unconditioned stimulus. It's not going to be exactly the same every time, so there'll be variations that elicit the unconditioned response. It too involves a stimulus class, just like we have a stimulus class of operant behavior. All neutral stimuli are not equally good to become CS. Some neutral stimuli will not be conditioned. This is a genetic issue, so certainly in the natural world, some stimuli that would more naturally precede the unconditioned stimulus are in fact easier to condition at and to become conditioned stimuli. And some neutral stimuli that might be conditioned for one unconditioned stimulus might not serve the same purpose for another. So all stimuli do not make equally good CSs, and it depends on the nature of the reflex or the reflexive relationship. When we talk about fear, or really talk about emotions, there is an involvement of respondent behavior and often an involvement of respondent conditioning. Naturally speaking, if we are startled by something or confronted with a very traumatic situation, what's activated is a set of responses, smooth muscle physiological responses, for example, those that affect the stomach, heart, glands, etc. Pain also elicits these same kinds of things. These automatic responses are adaptive, and they enhance our speed and strength momentarily to make us able to escape painful stimuli. So when this set of responses, this fear response or fight or flight response as it sometimes is also called, comes under control of a neutral stimulus, that can present problems. There are many human problems, phobias for example, where a previously neutral stimulus comes to elicit a conditioned response that's very similar to fear. And like any other emotional type thing, it's not just purely physiological in the end. It involves how we think about it. It involves operant behavior that may be related to escaping it and so forth. But nonetheless, classical conditioning is involved in fear, and neutral stimuli can come to elicit what the fear response, even though the neutral stimuli themselves have nothing to do with what was fearful in the natural world. Not all reflexes can be conditioned. Pupil contraction to light, for example, has not been conditioned. The release of insulin as a response to sugar has been conditioned. So, for example, a taste of sweetness, like a diet soda, can elicit insulin release, and that can cause problems for humans. Well, I'm not going to go through all of these. All reflexes cannot be conditioned, but some can, and some conditionable reflexes can cause problems when they come under control of neutral stimuli. Again, the example of insulin release. There are two phenomena that you need to know about. One's called overshadowing and one's called blocking. These same terms were used with operant stimulus control, as you may remember. But these can result in a failure for a conditioned stimulus to be acquired, for example. Overshadowing, two neutral stimulus are presented together before the unconditioned stimulus, and after a while, if you present both of them together, then the reflexive response is elicited, the conditioned reflex. On the other hand, if you then present them each separately, it may quite be possible that only one of them has become a conditioned stimulus, the one that's the most salient. Basically overshadows the other one so that it does not become a conditioned stimulus. And blocking, if there has been a conditioned stimulus for one reflex is paired with a neutral stimulus for another, then that neutral stimulus may never become a conditioned stimulus. It could be blocked. That could occur, as I've got it here. It could also occur in other ways, which I'm not going to get into, but basically there's always multiple stimuli present when conditioning occurs, and sometimes the presence of things in various ways can prevent one or more neutral stimuli from acquiring conditioned stimulus qualities. In the article that's optional for you to read, it talks about the functionality of Pavlovian condition. Some neutral stimuli have more biological relevance than others, and they are more easily conditioned because that's the way it is in the natural world. They acquire potency in order to prepare the organism to respond in a stronger way when the unconditioned stimulus occurs. Conditioned taste aversion, for example, and other kinds of things like that. That's discussed in your readings. The visual cues related to snakes appear to be genetic, and they can be very easily conditioned. Um, there is an example also talked about in your readings about observation of the female head in a grouse, I believe, or quail. And these kinds of things can become much more easily conditioned. And I've already said, of course, that all stimuli are not equal. But in the natural world, this is adaptive, so that some of these that are typically associated with the unconditioned stimulus can become conditioned stimuli, and they are preparing the organism to respond more appropriately when the unconditioned stimulus occurs. There is likely some involvement, as we've talked about, of classical conditioning involved with aversive stimuli, so that neutral stimuli associated with an aversive stimulus can themselves become aversive. We've talked about that with negative reinforcement. Um, this can involve also a thing called a conditioned emotional response, so that the neutral stimulus comes to elicit the same set of responses, a fear response, if you will, and what it elicits now is called a conditional emotional response, or conditioned emotional response, depending on which source you read. And these are probably associated with anxiety and other kinds of issues. And anxiety itself can be a problem when we avoid situations that make us anxious, and that avoidance is maladaptive. The degree to which this occurs is perhaps under some dispute, but nonetheless, the fact that neutral stimuli can come to elicit a conditioned emotional response is not under dispute. So at any rate, common problems with anxiety, other kinds of what's called experiential avoidance probably involve these conditional emotional responses, and points out to the importance of Pavlovian or classical conditioning in some common human problems. Can a previously neutral stimulus, the same previously neutral stimulus, can it acquire both a function of a conditioned stimulus and a Pavlovian conditioning and become a discriminative stimulus? In short, the answer is yes. So the same physical stimuli can have multiple functions, and that can create very interesting relationships between stimulus classes that are functional in an operant way and stimulus classes that are functional in a classical way. Relational frame theory, which you either have or will have some exposure to at the tutorial, talks about transformations of functions, and one of these transformations can involve classical conditioning. So words can become conditioned stimuli, and they can elicit, for example, conditional emotional responses. Could be involved in prejudice, certainly involved in advertising, and so forth, and it's likely to be involved in experiential avoidance and anxiety. So again, the same physical stimulus can acquire multiple functions. Just to continue the discussion about problems that are probably related to respondent conditioning, I mentioned that phobias, for example, are probably initially, at least partially, the result of such pairings. People have heard of claustrophobia, agoraphobia, one the fear of being in an enclosed space, and the other is the fear of being in open spaces. Those are very maladaptive, especially if they're related to avoidance of, for example, elevators, or avoidance of going outside. And in this case, certainly previously neutral stimuli, like being in the enclosed space, now elicit a conditional emotional response, or fear. And this has created a whole class of clinical problems. It's a little more complicated than this, and certainly operant avoidance is involved in this, but so is classical conditioning. And that many therapeutic procedures to resolve these are also then based, for example, on extinguishing the connection between the previously neutral stimulus and these fear responses. There's some discussion of that, or several discussions of that in your assigned reading. Just some final comments on the differences between operant and respondent conditioning. The differences aren't necessarily always clear, but the processes themselves are clear. Respondent conditioning, classical conditioning, results from pairing of two stimuli. Operant conditioning results from a contingent relationship between a behavior and a reinforcer. In respondent conditioning, the neutral and unconditioned stimuli precede the response. In operant condition, stimulus change, reinforcement, or punishment is after the response. The types of muscles involved in respondent and operant conditioning may not be dissimilar. In some cases, like the fear response, the muscles are smooth muscles. In other cases, the muscles involved, like with operant and also with reflexes like a knee reflex, are of a different sort. So I think the best way to think about the differences is in how conditioning occurs initially. And to summarize, classical conditioning is a very, very important way that we learn. In applied behavior analysis, applied behavior analysts tend not to pay much attention to classically conditioned problems, but they clearly acknowledge the fact that things like conditioned fear, conditioned emotions may be involved in some types of avoidance that can be solved, by the way, through more operant means. One more example here. You may have all heard of a thing called school phobia. Some children, is best probably called school avoidance, but in some cases the avoidance is exactly the same, but the origin of the avoidance could be completely operant, where kids complained about going to school, a mother or parents allow them to not go to school, so the child's whining and complaining was negatively reinforced. The mother or father was reinforced also by the kid stop whining, and now we have a condition of school avoidance. In some cases, school may become a condition aversive, so that as kids get near school, a conditional emotional response is elicited, and anxiety then plays a role in the avoidance. Obviously, someone has to let the kid avoid it, but the anxiety is involved, and the treatment of those kinds of school phobia or school avoidance might be different. So it is important that we understand this thing called classical or respondent conditioning.